In our first section, we're going to talk about practical tips for training our young friends. Kids, if you're involved in teaching kids, pay attention because you might get some practical tips. But if you train older kids, guess what? Almost all of my suggestions for you coming up now are going to apply. The first sort of ground rule is to put ground rules when you're going to train kids. Make sure you work on safety and boundaries. So assess the area where you're going to be training kids. You want to make sure it's very safe. If you have any loose electronic cables around or any lights hanging from the ceiling, if they're going to be throwing equipment, you want to make sure that everything is controlled by you. You want to make sure that the environment is very safe. And two, when the kids are around you, make sure you set boundaries. For example, let's call certain parts of our group fitness area out of bounds or off limits, for example. In other words, set your playground and let your kids know today these are the limits in which we're going to play. This area is out of bounds or this area is not our playground. If you're lucky enough to have an area where everything can be played in that whole space where you are, then there's no necessary need to say this is our boundary. But you want to make sure safety and boundaries are really number one. Number two, establish a vocabulary that kids understand. I think one of the most overused words in the group fitness industry, from cycle all the way to senior training, is go. Not only saying it, but screaming it. So we don't want to use this word with children, go, because they're already saying it to each other. I want to go. Can I go? Can I go to the bathroom? She's going. I want to go. So we want to take away that way from using that vocabulary with our children and nomenclature of our kids' fitness and use another word that might only be recognized by them for initiating and perhaps finishing movement. I like to suggest using the word chocolate. So my children know when I'm working with kids, and sometimes my adults that I call kids, when I yell the word or say the word chocolate, that's your call to action, your C to A. That's when I want you to get involved and start doing some moves based on the little game or the exercise that I've called to hand. So you can come up with some other words, and I'll share with you some more in this actual section of kids. But for now, have your ground rules. And one of them, after setting your safety and boundaries, is having a key word that no one starts ever moving until I give you the word to start. And that word for today's workshop, and then if you're teaching the same kids over time, keep it as the same word of consistency, will be the word chocolate. The next tip I'd like to share with you is limit the stimuli. If you're going to use balloons and bands and balls and steps and each other and partner games and mats and bars and balls, for example, then I suggest it's overload. Just like with adults, limit the stimuli. And on a maximum kids fitness interaction, perhaps of 30 minutes to 45 to an hour, I suggest 3 pieces of stimuli, no more. And one of those pieces of stimuli, if you have them working in groups of 2, is partner work. Therefore, I would only add maybe bars later on and maybe balloons later on, but not a 4th piece of equipment. Partner work actually counts, so limit the stimuli. Next, be prepared. For all the practical tips I'm sharing with you, whatever you're going to share in a 30, 45, 60-minute experience with your kids, always have some more exercises tucked in your back pockets. Why? You may find that children are finished with something and ready to move on, and you're left with nothing. Speaking of moving on, when do you want to finish a game or an exercise at hand? At the height of that exercise. In other words, you don't want to wait till something is milked and milked and milked and the ADD of what's next, teacher, is already setting in. When the height of a game is really capturing your audience, that's the time when you say, guess what? Maybe we'll play that again the next time we're together, but we're moving on now. And that makes everyone, oh, how wonderful to leave them wanting more. How poor it is to say, okay, that's all there is, and have everyone say, oh, thank goodness, right? So you want to make sure that you're prepared with extra games more than you'll ever get to, because you'll be surprised how maybe you will come to them and need them in a specific time. The next tip is to limit the words winning and losing. I like to use the suggestion, I want to see who can be the most XYZ and fill that in. I'm looking for the most XYZ for stable or strong or still or fast. as suggested words to put into your XYZ, but I'll never say, here's a competition, and I'm looking for one winner, and I'll never say who's better than everyone else, and I'll never say who's the loser or the losing team. So you want to overall limit your winning and losing, and that's important with this population because you want everyone to feel successful. They're already in other forms of fitness, picking each other and having their cliques, and they know through sort of their own social interactions who's more popular than others. So we want to create a very successful, engaging experience for all people, limiting who's winning and who's losing. The next practical tip is to use real terminology. For example, if we're going to do anything involving this part of the body, then I suggest we call this the abdominals, not stomach, not front of the body, not tummy. If we want them to be educated, we can always use a nomenclature or a vocabulary that's one step slightly ahead of what they may be learning in their homeroom social studies or English, for example. And they'll look forward to feeling this body part, knowing that's called the abdominals, and make it a game with them and say, what are we doing? What are you feeling? And when they yell back at you in unison, or almost all unison, abdominals, it's a very rewarding experience, and that's really fun. The next tip is, how do you get them to work in groups of 2 or more? And I like to create a lot of fun by creating group dynamics. One great way to get them to work in groups of 2 is to start not having them work in groups of 2. For example, here we're going to play a game, and I want you to line up across the middle of the room, stand specifically where you want them to be so they have a visual and an auditory cue. I want you to come here and line up, and I want the shortest person of the room that way and the tallest person of the room this way. Line up, and then it's sometimes giving them a quantifier, a time chronological quantifier. You have 10 seconds. Give them a little bit more, but the better they get at this, they'll be able to do it in 10 seconds. And all of a sudden, your least tall and most tall person are looking at each other, they're bonding, maybe not in the traditional cliques in which they find through society and going through school, but now you've given them a reason to look at each other and line up. Now you have a line, you can do line games in this order. Instead of form a line, they're always going to be with their friends. What thing you can do then is say the person to your left is your partner, starting with the least tall person, or starting with the tall person in reverse order. And then they're next to each other. Another thing you can do from this order of tall to least tall, or least tall to tall, is then say, I want you, Mark, tall on the end, and you, Mary, least tall on this end, to walk around and come to touch each other this way, interlocking your arms and the shoulders. Why this way? Kids sometimes don't like to touch each other. So if you say hold hands, especially 12, 13, 14 going through that puberty stage, they might not feel very comfortable saying we're holding hands doing what? But if you say interlock your arms and your own hands are on your own hips, you're touching and connected to someone, but you're not having to hold hands. Have them do this and then say Mary and Matthew, round forward and interlock yourselves together. And all of a sudden you've just created what? A circle. And now you can do some group dynamic games with kids in a circle. Remember, not just kids of a specific age, but they're touching this way, then they can release their hands and everyone is connected. That's wonderful. You've made a circle and now you can do some partner games in a circle. Look at the person to your right, look at the person to your left, and now you have a new partner.